This is the 7th of our series on archetypes in the middle way. And this one is called Integrating the Anima Animus. So in the last couple of sessions, we've been working our way through 4 archetypal functions. So the last couple of them involve the hero and the shadow. So the function that we were talking about in relation to the hero is goal direction and goal directionless. And the function of the shadow responding to threats. And so in both of those examples, I'm thinking of the function of the archetype in each case is to inspire us in the long term for the maintenance of that function. So we do need to be able to persevere towards our goals or adapt our goals. And the hero can help to inspire us to do that, whatever shape the hero may take, which may be very non-traditional. Whatever symbol it is that inspires you to do that is your hero symbol, if you like. And with the shadow, we talked also about the differences between genuine threats and things that might just make us unnecessarily anxious, and how we can try and respond appropriately to threats, and the shadow symbols may help to remind us of that. So this is all shaping up a picture of how we can use archetypal symbols to remind us and inspire us of an integrative progression, an integrative practice. So we're now coming to the anima animus. Now, so the anima animus is concerned with relationships. At least that's how I interpret it, and I'll go in a bit later into how I've arrived at that from the original Jungian material. But it's concerned very much with the other, as I see it. So the attractive other. So we've had the shadow, which is the rejected stuff of the hero, who is attractive in pursuing a goal of some kind, so it's instrumental in pursuing a goal. But the anima animus is concerned with relationships, so ongoing connections between us and somebody else, or between us and the image of somebody else in our psyches. So the other can inspire us to develop and to become more adequate to the conditions. Sorry, there's a storm going on here, so apologies for the rain noise. So this other is an aspect of ourselves. I think that's probably a key insight I get from Jung and his approach, that ourselves and our own potential are symbolized in the archetypes and the archetypal forms. But of course, we find those symbols in others themselves as we meet them, or as we meet their images and concepts of others. So the other is in ourselves, but it's represented by others, if you like. So developing that potential in ourselves also, I think, has a social function, in the sense that it helps us to relate better to the complexity of actual others. So it's not as though we're only looking at the individual psychologically without connecting to the wider social world. It's just that we're working with both at the same time, not neglecting one or the other. So the anima animus can be represented by a wide range of symbols, as with any of the archetypal functions that we're discussing in this series. And obviously the traditional association from the Jungian tradition of talking about the anima animus is to talk about symbols of the opposite sex. And that very often seems to be the case. That's a kind of very likely for most of us to be our kind of base or symbols of the animus, but not always. And again, I'll come to look a bit more about why that's the case, why it's not always like that, and why I think we need a bit more nuance in our understanding of how this works. So that's why I prefer to say the attractive other, rather than talking solely in terms of sex. So, like the other archetypes, the anima animus is subject to projection. So again, I've talked about projection in relation to the other archetypal functions. So, for example, the hero, if you project the hero, he offers you a magic shortcut to your goal, if you like, or you can identify yourself with the hero and think that you can reach the goal without having to go through all the complexities of the process. So that's a projection. It's actually distracting us from an effective approach to things by thinking that our own process, our own archetypal images are out there in somebody or something else. It's the same with the shadow. When we project the shadow, we demonize. We think that the shadow is the boss, or whoever else it is we hate may be out there. So the anima animus is obviously similar, subject to similar kinds of projection, perhaps more markedly and obviously than the others, in fact. So the objectification of the other, part of that. So ceasing to recognize the other as a person, as complex and alive and like us, seeing them as an object in some way and trying to possess them seems to often be at the basis of the anima animus projection. And that can take all kinds of romantic forms. So romantic delusions are very much involved in the projection of the anima animus. Okay, so that's kind of a brief intro to the subject, but I'm going to look in a bit more detail at several aspects of this. So the Jungian origins of the idea of anima animus and the ways I think they need adapting. The whole relationship to specialization is fascinating. So I see the anima animus as kind of a compensatory archetypal function to over-specialization in our lives. I'll also look at a bit of the range of symbols and share some pictures with you of possible anima animus symbols, and talk a bit more about the projection and, of course, the integration of that projection. So the overall focus, obviously, as with all these talks, is about integration in the end, how we can integrate the archetypal function. Okay, so but before I get on to all of that, I just want to quickly share with you one picture. Which is a bit of a cliche, really, but you may have seen it before. It's a picture by a pre-Raphaelite artist called Frederick Leighton, and it's very much of pre-Raphaelite romantic Arthurian picture, yeah, and it's called Godspeed. It's obviously the lady is seeing off her knight, going on his quest or going into battle, whatever it is. So I mean, this is well, it's very interesting from the point of view it has both the anima and the animus in it at the same time, you could say, or a very likely anima and animus in it at the same time. So one question you might like to ask yourself is, which do you identify here with the lady or the knight? Which of those is the attractive other for you? Is it both? Could be both. Maybe it's not at all straightforward. So it may not easily, obviously for some people it's just a matter of sex and what's associated with each sex in response to the other, but it may not be as simple as that. So there's obviously a very strong sexual dimorphism here, isn't polarization between the two sexes in these very cliched forms almost. And but those are the forms we're more likely to use as symbolizations really of the animal or the animus. And as you'll see also from the knight here, there's a strong overlap between the animus and the hero, which is something we'll need to explore a little, I think, to disentangle those two ideas. They may not need that much disentangling, but to get some idea of the difference. Okay, so so that's just to start us off, I guess, with a little bit of a visual image. But let me say a bit more to start with about the Jungian origins of this idea. Okay, so the word anima is the Latin word for soul. And there are different sort of senses for the word soul, and the perhaps best established Platonic sense of soul is a kind of essential identity, the real you, as it were. And that's the sense that's been adopted in traditional Christianity, particularly the Catholic Church. So you may well be familiar with it from there. The Jungian use of the word soul, though, is a bit different from that. It's about the completion of the identity that we feel, that we encounter and experience. So it's an integrative identity, if you like, a completion. So the soul is the bit we don't feel whole without, if you like. So our soul is the sort of slightly estranged, slightly lost bit of us, which if we could somehow find it and be one with it, we would be whole. So it's the I would resist anyway thinking about it as an essential identity, because that brings in all sorts of metaphysical assumptions. So I think it's helpful to make a distinction between the Jungian and the Platonic ways of talking about the soul. And Jung talks a lot about the soul in his Red Book, which is a fascinating document in search for the soul. And what he means by the soul there, in the word that's translated as soul, is anima. And also the romantic idea of the soulmate, that also seems to connect with the idea of the anima animus in a rather Jungian sense, perhaps. But of course, the soulmate is often a projection. Now, animus, on the other hand, is I think Jung's kind of later construction. So when he started off saying that the anima is a feminine symbol of completion for a man, then of course the question is, well, what about women? How are they going to feel about this? And so he said, well, women have an animus with a parallel kind of symbolism and archetypal function. So the animus is a masculine symbol for a woman in the way that Jung presented it. And in his later work, in Aeon, for example, which is later on in Jung's collected works, he describes this distinction between the anima and the animus, and very much in gender essentialist terms. That women, almost like he presents that women always have an animus figure or need an animus figure, and men always have an anima figure. Which obviously, in terms of a lot of modern ways of thinking, is probably not going to sit well. It's a bit old-fashioned for many people. And I certainly find it questionable. So if you take on board any of the kind of insights one could get from feminism or from LGBTQ kind of thinking, then you need a more flexible way of thinking about this. And I think there is some inspiration for that in the Red Book. So the earlier Jung talks much more about kind of rebalancing and how these kinds of animus images are just about the other bit of us, really. So the attractive other is whatever we're not. So that doesn't just mean the other sex, but also maybe a different age, a different kind of character in other respects. So certainly I've found that as a way into sort of connect Jung you know, in many ways, I'm much more impressed by the earlier Jung of the Red Book than I am by the more sort of laid out Jung of the collected works quite often. So basically, one can avoid gender essentialism by understanding the anima animus as the symbolized attractive other, and just say, well, whatever that is for you. So wherever you start, you're the best person to judge that. What do you find attractively other? But obviously there's a starting point, and there are those things we might reflect on to kind of become aware of our starting point. What is it that, as it were, animates us, completes us? And I think one aspect of that starting point is to recognize and accept the biology and the social conditioning that have helped to form us. You know, so in general, that does mean, you know, there is sexual dimorphism. Men and women are different in various biological ways, have different sexual and reproductive instincts, and so on. There are various biological systems we have for identifying desirable partners, which obviously kick in when we're thinking of, you know, we're identifying what makes a beautiful person of the opposite sex, for example. That's going to feed into our images of the animal animus, obviously. There's also, of course, social influences. So there's all the social, cultural shaping of our ideas of say, beauty and inspiration from others, from the other, and the social systems that have helped to form that in marriage and the family and so on. I think it's helpful to just accept all that and say, well, actually, the archetypal inspiration isn't really about any of that. It may be rooted in that, but it's about what we do with it, how we respond to what that gives us. So I don't see the anima animus as just a sexual response. It's you can't reduce it to a sexual response. It's about whether we channel the associations we built up on that response of attraction to help inspire us over time, to help to integrate us and to bridge those gaps, those incompletenesses. So that's how I think all the archetypes work, as I've been trying to put forth in this series. They help us to develop they help to inspire us in a practice which develops a more integrated experience over time. So the need for that channeling of whatever we start with is going to be the same, whatever our biological and social conditioning and our sexual responses may be. Another way you can see that is the sublimation. So that's another way that psychoanalysis is talked about, this kind of thing. So we can have initial sexual responses, and then we can try and sublimate them. We can push them in a particular, more helpful direction if they're a bit too crude. And so we're likely to have things we find attractive to the other, but what do we do with them? So obviously, if you're thus attracted to your own sex, then that's still the attractive other. And it's still just as much subject to inspiration, projection, and integration. And the same is going to apply if you're asexual or androgynous or transsexual or whatever, that there'll still be attractive others as well, probably. But beyond that, obviously, I shouldn't say too much because you need to judge for yourself. Now, one question which I think George asked me on a previous discussion is why do I still use the term anima animus for this? So I think the Jungian idea needs a bit of updating and adapting. Obviously, we could use a different term, but at the same time, I think there's a lot in the Jungian approach which is worth preserving. So that makes it tricky. And I haven't found an obvious alternative. So although anima animus with the slash in the middle is a bit clumsy. There's no kind of single word that can do both things. And although Jung did actually supply one, he has the word syzygy, S-Y-Z-Y-G-Y. But obviously that word doesn't mean very much to most people. But you will find that word in Aeon. So I haven't tried to use that word, but so I suppose that continuing to use the term for anima animus just makes the point that the vast majority of our anima animus functions and symbolism are still built on sexual responses in one way or another, when you connect it to them. And we can still have that connection and recognize the strength of that connection without being limited by it. Okay, so that's one aspect of where all this is coming from, if you like. But another one, I think, is the relationship to specialization, which I think is another interesting thing to explore. So I mentioned earlier that I think the anima animus function can be seen as a compensation for specialization, particularly for over-specialization. So I mean here specialization in the widest sense. So whenever we specialize in whatever way, in our roles, in our profession, whatever it is, we gain some capacities and we gain some potentials. We're able to do new things, understand new things, and so on. But at the same time, we lose other potentialities. So it's almost like, yeah, but when I was a boy, I used to collect stamps, right? And I collected all the stamps, and I could never make up my mind to specialize in one country or one type of stamp, because then I wouldn't be able to collect the others. So we have to narrow our potential in some way if we specialize. So there's a social sacrifice, if you like, involved in specialization, the sacrifice of our wholeness, and indeed the sacrifice of our individuality, which is tied up with our individual wholeness. And of course, society puts us in a restrictive role as well. We know that, if you become the teacher, or you become the wife, or whatever your role, others are placing you in that role, and that cuts you off from other kinds of development, potentially. Yeah, obviously we can't avoid specialization to a fair degree, and probably I'd imagine it goes back in some ways probably to the Paleolithic, so the first kinds of specializations are probably gender specializations arising from sexual difference, so the women specialized in looking after the children and the men went out hunting and so on. That's the stereotype anyway. And then we've developed other specializations as we went along, so age specializations, class specializations, professional specializations, and so on. So all of this constricts us, as well as in some ways helping us in helping society. And in the Red Book, as I've already mentioned, Jung kind of presents animal animus symbols, though he doesn't use the term in the Red Book, but he presents them as compensation of any kind. So he talks about, for example, the relationship between the old and young, or between leaders and servants, or between cleverness and strength. And so our attractive others are likely to be compensatory in any of those ways. So he noticed, for example, that his anima figures, they're obviously female, but because he was an older man who was already middle-aged by the time he was producing the Red Book, they were a younger woman, so they were a maiden, as it's translated in the Red Book. Yeah, so there's all about the maiden figure you find in the Red Book. And obviously that's very common for older men, and you'll find the same things probably for all the four quadrants, if you like. So older men, older women, younger men, younger women are all likely to have opposites across the that quartile. So yeah, that kind of that projected anima animus. If we project our anima animus in those sorts of ways, then you know, our specialization, like the limitations placed on us by specialization, can just lead us to kind of idealize and want to be something else, or to appropriate that which is different from us, the attractive other. So the classic of that might be the older man might want to possess or marry a younger woman, say, and in some measure that would be him trying to get over his own limitations in some magical way, you know, by appropriating somebody else who's got these qualities that he can't have himself anymore. And obviously, when people do that and it's all projected, that tends to reinforce all the rigidity of the differences and to create conflict. Yeah, so it's another way in which you know, projection and conflict are connected. But if we can integrate the anima animus, then I think that helps to compensate for specialization. So we're helping to develop some of the qualities of the other in ourselves. So in some ways, it's impossible to separate this from the wider need for synthesis and imagination. So being aware of the possibilities of who we are and how we can do things beyond the ways we've got used to. Or another way you can think about this is just sort of working on our weaknesses. So not just developing our stronger areas, but our weaker areas, and that's pretty tough, really. So it's one thing to keep going on a furrow you've ploughed your whole life, and another one to start another one and try something different, which doesn't really fit your temperament. Okay, so that's a little bit about specialization, which I think is highly relevant here. Let me say a little bit more and also show some pictures of possible anima animus symbols. So, as I've said before in this series, we need to clearly differentiate symbols from archetypes. So archetypes are the function as a whole, the symbols are the specific instances of that which inspire you. So symbols are going to be different for each person and have different effects on each person. But obviously there are some cultural similarities between what we're likely to find symbols of animals. And we can talk about images, but many of the symbols for you may be actual people you know, or they may in some cases just be concepts. Yeah, so obviously it's much easier for me as a man to talk about anima symbols than animus symbols, and I'd be interested to hear anything anyone else wants to say about animus symbols that I've missed later on, but I'll have a try anyway. But let me start with animus symbols, which are kind of easier. So obviously, feminine anima symbols tend to emphasize things like beauty, fertility, nurturance, sometimes a kind of feminine power, mystery, also kind of self-contained contentment. So they can include mother figures, child figures, the kind of mysterious enchantress, the mysterious nymph, the goddess. You know, all these are kind of classic anima symbols. So let me show a few pictures. Yeah, so this is a picture by a German artist called Jörg Yanni, I would guess it's pronounced. So bathing silence, it's called, or going to be bathing nymphs, another translation. So this is like slightly from afar, isn't it, which makes it mysterious. So it's a kind of classic anima scene, I think, very much because of the mystery and the nakedness, but also the setting. So it's this mysterious cove. So the landscape itself adds to the ways it might symbolize the animal. And the sea, of course, possibly itself. Or another example. Yeah, so the picture I put on front of Archetypes in Religion and Beyond is the Annunciation picture. And this particular one is by Simone Martini. So it's quite an early Renaissance Annunciation picture. Yeah, but with all classic features of such pictures. Now, what I find particularly moving or inspiring about such pictures, I think, is that you have the encounter between the mysterious potential of the God archetype through the angel and Mary as an animal figure. And she's just encountering something totally gobsmackingly new and impossible to grasp beyond herself. So it's that kind of way it captures that kind of response. I mean, of course, the anima figure itself can do that as well as the. So this is an instance where the anima and the God archetypes can connect together. But both of them are depicted here within one picture. So that's the kind of, for me personally, this is the kind of picture that I connect with the anima. May not be for your cup of tea at all, very likely not, but just to share with you the kind of thing that moves me. And then there are, of course, Buddhist pictures. So here's a classic white Tara picture. Well, actually, this is a Western Buddhist white Tara picture by a local Western Buddhist artist. So there you've got a kind of serenity, haven't you? Intense serenity. So she's associated with long life. So obviously, the Buddhist tradition uses these animal figures as a subject of visualization, and indeed in an explicitly integrative way, really, because often the visualizations include visualization of yourself as the figure. So you're not just contemplating the figure as other, you're also partly making it self. Another kind of Buddhist one which I can find moving is the anima image. So again, you've got a much more sort of stately serenity, that's still a femininity linked with power, I think, in that one. But coming more back to Western art images, yeah, so there's a maternal aspect of the anima figure. So the relationship between the mother and the anima is an interesting one. Yeah, so it can go either way, because the attractive other could be nurturing and have the features of motherhood, or could be innocent and have the features of a child. So this is a Raphael Madonna, which obviously for many people has those classic features of the archetypal mother figure. And then yeah, before I get on to one more anima, before I get on to animus, so this is a picture which is actually in my book of this is a figure of nature by an Italian sculptor called Rovan Ruggiero, which I took this photo of myself in Trieste. And this is quite interesting also because it's I mean, it's a symbolization of nature, but it's not at all idealized. She seems to me to be a very sort of real, complex, but nevertheless strongly symbolic person. So there's this very interesting, well done mixture, I think, of something that comes across as very human, but at the same time has this universal symbolic resonance. So figures of nature, you know, if stuff to do with God and religion and so on doesn't do it for you, then maybe nature does, and depictions of nature. Okay, so now, as I mentioned, animus figures are tricky because, for one thing, they could get mixed up with heroes, and for another, probably needs the perspective of someone who appreciates them more than I do. So I can hear more later. Yeah, I wondered about blacksmiths and things like that. So just as something to set your imagination going if you need something. So this is a kind of figure of Vulcan in the Roman pantheon with his hammer. And the interesting thing about blacksmiths is that they're not just warriors, but they are very masculine figures. And they're engaged in a kind of productive, not just a protective sort of process, but also you know, putting strength and power into something that's beneficial for the rest of the community. And you get the same in some classic depictions of Vulcan, the blacksmith god in classical mythology. And this is a blacksmith's shop depicted by Joseph Wright in the 18th century. What I quite like about this is it's a bit like a Rembrandt picture because you've got this light in the center, which gives you a sense of the well, the illumination of in the center of the picture, if you like, which can connect with the idea of integration. But it certainly conveys the kind of the power and the focus of that kind of energy, if you like, that kind of energy. Okay, so but whatever animus figures are and whatever works for you is probably most likely to involve things like power in a benign sense, protectiveness, assertiveness, possibly industry, application, focus, those kinds of qualities. But of course, those are kind of classic, somewhat cliched ones, if you like, but there are also possibly animus figures or symbols which are not sexually differentiated or possibly not even human. So you can have that sense of the attractive other in, for example, an alluring landscape, maybe a lovely cove or a glade. I think you get a lot in kind of the feelings people have about exotic destinations and the tradition of Orientalism in Western countries. So the allure of the East as the attractive other as a whole. And sometimes that becomes masculine or feminine, but usually it's just the East, isn't it? It's just this otherness which intrigues us and may inspire us. And I think my impression is that to some extent this works the other way around as well, as that's the mysterious West for people in the Far East, which can be idealized. So yeah, you can get these kind of broader symbols, and also you can get objects which are associated with the animal animus. So think about the power of a comb, for example. You can invoke an entire world of femininity with a comb without thinking in a woman with it. So anything that brings up that mysterious attraction can do it. Okay, but so let me go on then before we finish with say more about projection and integration of the animal animus. So the projection of the animal animus involves the assumption that the archetypal function is in the other person. They are that function, they'll do it for you if you like. So the function, if you like, is to make us more whole, to bring in that other part of us which by specializing we have abandoned or not fulfilled. So in a projection, there's a kind of magical element. You know, we think instantly by having or using this other person in some way, they can overcome that difficulty. It's a wisdom from specialization. So when we do that, there's a failure to recognize our own responsibility for actually developing in non-specialized ways. So you know, the fact that we could ourselves overcome some of those limitations, at least that have been imposed on us by specialization. And if we're going to do it, then we have to take responsibility for it, not pass it to someone else. So this kind of projection, though, yeah, it needs to be distinguished, I think, from the mere fact of being in relationship with somebody else. So it's not necessarily what goes on in the relationship, but obviously it can be. So a relationship can also stimulate and support our own development, or of course it can substitute for our own development. So it all depends on how much contextual awareness we bring to that relationship. And generally, when we engage in projective relationships, they tend to be appropriative. So we tend to objectify the other person, and they become instrumental to us. So they're not fully recognized as a complex other. So that can obviously take a romanticized form. So the idea, you know, she's my true soulmate, I can't possibly live without her. So that's all placing it on her as the other, as the attractive. And of course, marriage can be a traditional means of this kind of appropriation. So if you think of a lot of 19th century novels, including Jane Austen, they end with the marriage. You know, so the complexities are gone through, but they stop at the marriage, which is where the appropriation has happened. So we don't need to worry about anything after that, because it's assumed because we fixed everything by getting the right partner. But of course, as we're probably aware, that's usually where all the complexities and difficulties start. This is continuing. And obviously also we need to distinguish that kind of appropriation from committed relationships, that, you know, the mere fact of having a committed relationship, which enable people to support each other in their development. So if you've got a marriage between two individuals who see themselves as individuals, that's quite a different thing, I think, certainly in my own experience, from appropriative projective relationship. So I certainly want to avoid any impression that love and marriage themselves are the problem. Yeah, it's all about how we use those things, given the animal animus tendencies. So the integration then of the anima animus is overcoming any projection we may have, as well as positively relating to the anima animus to help us to become more whole and to overcome any specialized limitations we may have. So obviously that involves taking responsibility for our relationships with others, whether those are actual others or symbolic others. So that doesn't necessarily mean either having or not having relationships. Yeah, we might need to work at the individuality of the relationship. If there is any tendency towards projection that we can identify. Things like breaks and contrasts, in my experience, can really help to give perspective, to help us to look in a more individual way at the whole thing. So things like solitary retreats, I'd highly recommend, because so even if you're intensively relating to another person, you spend a bit of time apart, you spend some time by yourself, you get another perspective on that situation, you get a new context to look at it in. So I seem paradoxical to some people that you can actually improve your relationship with somebody by leaving them behind for a bit, but it really works, I think. So mature relationships need to be between independent individuals, and part of that also is obviously going to be part of, it's going to be involved having a sense of our limitations, and of how we might be inspired to work on them by the example of people with other qualities. So if you're inspired by someone else who has really different qualities from you, that can actually be an encouragement, and being in close proximity to them can, of course, help you to develop those qualities. But you also need to take responsibility for deliberately making that happen in some way, to learn from them rather than use as a substitute. Yeah, so, and I can link that really with, so there's a lot of stuff about relationships and how we relate to others, but there's also the positive symbology of the anima animus. And so the anima animus figures, symbols for us, can be something that helps us to celebrate the positive effect of the attractive other for us, to help us to build up positive associations with the other, so that they can be used as markers, so that it can keep reminding us of the possibility of developing as an individual as well. Okay, so, and with the integration process, I think it's very worth reflecting on the relationship between the anima animus symbol and other archetypal functions. So I've already mentioned the relationship with the hero. So the key difference, I think, between the animus and the hero is that the hero is on a quest. The animus is a relationship. So if the hero is doing some specific thing that inspires you, has a goal and is inspiring you towards that goal, directly or indirectly, then it's a hero function. But if it's something that's part of your life, the qualities of the animus, the ones you could imitate, try and avoid substituting, then that's obviously more the anima animus territory. But there's definitely a fuzzy line there. But there can also be anima figures who might be heroic. So the superwoman and so on, or there's heroic female figures, Lara Croft or whatever springs to mind. Yeah, so you can merge those functions. Then there's the shadow. Now, this is a tricky one, I think, because it's easy to demonize the other. So just by a flip, so by moving from idealizing the other to demonizing it. So when you fall out of love, then you might flip instantly from idealizing this person to demonizing. So then we move directly into the shadow, which is obviously just as projected as the initial animus symbol. So that kind of relationship with the shadow, you can see that in falling out of love, possibly more on a cultural level. You could see it in witch trials, for example, male reactions, established male reactions against women, and possibly some sort of on the other side, the shadow animus you might get in some forms of extreme misandrist feminism, but obviously quite a limited movement. But it's yeah, so it's probably more important to recognize that the shadow is like us in some way. That's probably the key way of avoiding projection, which connects the animus with the shadow, so that we don't just flip or move so quickly from idealizing to demonizing. And then, of course, I've already mentioned the enunciation symbols, but the connections between the God archetype and the animus. So searching for our soul can lead us immediately towards the God archetype, really. So in some circumstances, there isn't a very clear distinction that one merges into the other, because the God archetype, as I'll explore more in the next session, is very much about the whole of our unfulfilled potential. So you can develop in that way through, for example, feminine in nature. You could progress from more specific, attractive other in the feminine, and then that becomes the whole of nature around you. Or in the enunciation figure, as I mentioned, or with Buddhist figures like Taro or Paniparitar, leading you towards a larger engagement with symbolic enlightenment. So there's a variety of ways that we could connect the functionality of the animus with the God archetype, and so I may come back to that next time. Anyway, I better shut up at this point and open up to questions. Or any comments or anything, any ideas of your own, really. So one thing I'd be very interested to hear from is if you've got perhaps very different experiences or different views of the symbology of the animus and what it means to you. Laura?
One thing that comes to mind when you were talking about sort of confusing the animus with either the hero, the shadow, or the God archetype, I was wondering if in the experience of, say, finding a symbol of the animus, say if I were finding a symbol of that archetype, is it possible to have a shared potential, a sense of a shared potential with that kind of symbolic figure, or is that the abdication of the sort of responsibility to sort of realize in oneself what that shared potential is about? I'm thinking about, in concrete terms, there are, when you were describing this, I was thinking about several writers who I absolutely love, whose work I've been reading my whole life, or whole adult life. And I feel like I've sort of grown up with them. And in a way, I think they're animus figures for me. But I also feel very encouraged to be creative by them, by that experience with them. And so is this, what you're talking about?
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay. All right.
I mean, obviously the kind of basic starting point tends to be pretty projected. So when you're a child or a teenager or something, it's very likely. You read this wonderful writer and maybe if it's the opposite sex and you say, oh, this person is wonderful. And that's more projected and appropriate. But as you develop, it may well be that person and their example has inspired you to develop things in yourself. And that's an integrative process, the kind of that I was talking about, integrating the animus possibly in that kind of circumstance. Yeah. I mean, there may be heroic aspects of that as well. You think about the effort involved in writing the book, for example.
Yeah.
Encouraged by someone else who's done so.
Yeah.
That starts to have a heroic function.
Another
I'm just
thing
reminded actually of
yeah.
Sorry, God, when I was just before this session, I decided to ask my wife for her perspectives on the animus and what she thought of as the animus. And she rather surprised me because she started talking about kind of knight in shining armor, which is a classic animus figure, of course, but she was the knight in shining armor. So I mean, that tells you what an integrated woman she is, I think. But but she has identified with that figure, but also taken responsibility for it being her. And so so obviously we don't have to just think of the symbols in their as it were less integrated forms. They may well be already quite integrated.
Yeah, I find it interesting, actually really interesting what you said with the specialization, because I was wondering about this from my own experience, because I don't know, I feel like actually for me, what I find attractive in that sense, it's more, it's not necessarily all things that are like different from me, where I would say like it's something that's lacking in my own personality, but I'd rather, like when I thought about it, because for example, I'm also attracted to maybe more, like you could say, more intellectual people, even though I myself would say I think far too much. So it's not something that I'm necessarily missing in my life. And also like, but I think whatever like realizes about this, the ideas that I have are very strong, or like fantasies you could say, is that maybe it's not just about something that's missing, but also how you wish you would, like, or that the interactions that you imagine, it's more how you want to treat, like how you wish you would treat a part of yourself in some sense. So like that usually if you imagine it, for me as a woman, or if you have some animus figure, usually you imagine yourself in a more nurturing role. And I think I don't do that to myself enough in some sense. So there's sort of this aspect of, okay, you don't, I just realized that essentially through this, what you said, but like, it's not really just something that's missing in that sense that I see directly in the other person. So I don't see them as the nurturing part, but I see myself doing that. And then also maybe I would like to be them in that situation, because I want to treat myself like that. I don't know if that makes sense. That's like almost like a double reversal. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you could see that as the integrative process, that maybe starts as compensatory in some ways, but gradually becomes more integrated. But you could also think in terms of the hero, if you're inspired by somebody who's like you in some ways to do the kind of things they do.
If an animus figure, say for me, inspires courage to do something, is that the heroic, or is that a quality that the animus can have that one can gradually take into oneself as having courage to do things that you want to do?
Could be both. I mean, we don't have to make a rigid distinction.
Okay.
There's obviously a blurred line there.
Okay.
Insofar as there is a distinction, it's does the heroic sort of inspires you to a particular goal, perhaps, or maybe sequence of goals, but whereas the relationship is an ongoing thing in itself.
Now, it's as if the relationship is an inspiration to be in a certain way, to be what one can be or wants to be.
To adapt one's character. Okay, maybe I better move on then at this stage to talk about the practice focus before we run out of time. I'm just going to run through, in this case, 4 stages. So these are suggestions for ways you could apply some of the stuff in the talk. So the practice focus is finding wider inspiration in the other without appropriation. So 4 stages I'm going to suggest. So as before in these practice focuses, these stages are primarily stages of reflection, right? So you could do this in a meditation process, or you could do some sort of journaling process, or just reflect, preferably in some sort of systematic way on these 4 points. So the first point is to ask, what sort of other inspires you? What sort of other inspires you? So this could be people who are different from you, or you could think about images that have a strong emotional resonance for you. Images in the broader sense, so not necessarily visual images, maybe imaginary, fictional images. So just getting some idea of what the animus means to you, what makes the most impression on you. So then the second stage, so identify one particular inspiring image or person as a particular focus, and explore in more detail how they inspire you. So I think that means sort of teasing out what aspects of yourself they appeal to and how they might specifically help you to develop, perhaps in ways that you might have had to close down or feel you've had to close down a bit, paths you didn't take in your own development. So you become specialized in some ways. How can this image or person open up things that seemed have become a bit closed? Okay, so by that stage you should have both the sort of emotional response. So the first stage is about finding that emotional response, and the second is thinking more about, well, in practice, how can that help, and reflecting more technically, as it were, on how it can help you. Then the third stage, think about your past experience. So do you have past experience of projecting onto people or images like this? So how did you think when you projected in the past, and I think we all have, it's very likely we have, how did you think they could serve you, or how did you, what purpose did they have for you? What did they do for you at that point? And presumably now, if you have a slightly bigger view of it, how have you arrived at a wider contextualization of this projection? Okay, so that third section, third point is reflecting on your past projections. So with the wider perspective of the present, what's your history of projecting animus, and how can you learn from it? And then fourth and final point, can you imagine your soul? So soul may or may not be the right word for you. A more complete you, like, so if soul doesn't fit, find other words to do it. So can you imagine the soul kind of incorporates this image into your own experience? Can you kind of encapsulate a symbol of that soul that you can come back to and that can inspire you in the future? So that's perhaps the most challenging bit. So once you've reflected on what you respond to and how that can help you and what you need to be aware of in your past experience, what really encapsulates an image in the widest sense of image that you can come back to as an associative symbol for you of the side of you that you would like to develop to complete your experience. Okay, so as usual, I will put up my notes on the Slack area from this session, which will include the practice focus. So if you haven't got notes on it, then you can refer to it there. Does anyone have any questions about the practice focus or about anything else?
I have a question about the practice focus, and also you're talking about the anima/animus. Are you using that sort of composite term to represent a relationship, or is so that what we're talking about when we talk about a relationship with an animus symbol is about a relationship to that symbol, about the relationship? Or are you just using anima, not just, but using anima animus to incorporate what men and women will separately, say if I'm going to choose an animus symbol instead of an anima symbol, or am I going to choose both, or is that something that just happens?
I think that's something you need to reflect on and decide for yourself.
Okay.
I mean, that's why I've carefully left it open in the way that I think Jung doesn't do sufficiently. That he expects there to be an anima for men and an animus for women. So I think it's, reflect on your own experience. What compensates? What makes you feel more complete? What inspires you to develop in a way that makes you more complete? So that's what I mean by animus.
Okay.
So whatever symbolization that is that inspires you, you are then in relationship with.
Okay.
But that obviously could have a complex relationship with actual relationships you have with actual people, or it could be primarily a relationship with a symbol or an idea that speaks to you.
But that's great. It really clears that up to talk about the idea of the completeness, about why you are choosing a symbol because of that sense of completeness and the loss of that over-specialization.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, so you can think of it in those terms, or you can think of it in terms of the attractive other, mysterious other, but that's likely to be what's missing for you, that you're not very explicit about, because you haven't made it immediately part of your identity and your world, but nevertheless it's got this wider role in your wider potential psyche.
Mhm.
Yeah, I hadn't come across before because I haven't read this chapter in the book about the way of looking at it. It's not just about the attractive other, but about this idea of compensation for our over specialization. So that idea in itself is, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting to me. So I think I'll go away now and have a look at that chapter in the book and think a bit more about what that means, because that makes a bit more sense to me.
Yeah. Well, for me, that connects a lot with my thoughts about academic specialization as well, and the constraints that puts us under, which is something I've personally bucked against a lot, as you probably know.